my experience, and I know a lot of other conlangers that have written about this, it's an eternal quest. It's just ongoing, a continuous process. You don't really know why you're doing it. You just have some sort of internal drive to do it. It's like everyone knows about these languages, but they don't know that conlanging and conlangers are like a model, like a current active subculture.
In the hekagote conlangs, Habibi tivakevet, tivat tokan.
Пока. In Hodke, Montetoka,
How would I define a constructed language? Because the division between what we might think of as a purely natural language and a constructed language is not quite as clear as it might seem.
A language where one person sat down and said, this is what the language is going to be. Here's the vocabulary, here are the rules, here's how we put it together.
I really don't use a hard definition of that because I don't want to. I don't want people asking me these difficult questions as to whether or not ASL and Hebrew and Haitian Creole are natural languages or constructed languages. It's awkward.
Natural language, of course, the usual conception is that it just arises naturally in the community. So the reason why the difference is not always completely clear is that there's cases like, say, Creole languages, where the language emerges in a relatively short time.
And I also excluded things like programming languages where someone sits down and engineers it, but it's not for the purpose of human communication.
Conlanging sometimes is a way to almost proactively try to imagine how many other ways can I think of saying this.
It's creating some sort of way that people could hypothetically communicate and giving it the structure and form that you want it to have. Now, some people have taken this and done things like Esperanto, where they're actually intending this to be used for communication. But I feel like these days especially, people are more doing it kind of for the beauty of it and the form and design of it, rather than trying to do it for any sort of actual communicative intent.
And now that it's in the public eye with films and TV shows, it even has a little glamour to it. So it's not just this disgusting waste of time anymore. It's kind of cool, it's interesting, it's artistic.
It's pretty much the same as painting, except instead of colors you use language, syntax, morphology, phonology, and all that comes with it. I see it as an expression also of myself. I mean, depends on the mood and what kind of things I like, that kind of languages I create.
What makes it fun is you've got all these persnickety little details and you can play with them and you can mess with them and you can go, oh, I can make an exception here, and then you can go, no, maybe I shouldn't, and then you fix something else and then you break this thing over here, and you can work on this thing for years.
Yeah.
I have.
Yeah. I think
it's just fun.
I think that's one of the things that I enjoy the most too. It's like, you always
build sentences.
Yeah, you always come up with one or two ideas, and then you start with those ideas and you start to sketch them out. And then as you start to do things it's like, well, how am I going to do relative clauses?
Yeah,
how do
I hate relative clauses.
I
think
love
relative clauses
I
should
love
be
relative
outlawed.
clauses. I love relative. That's the other thing. It's like, well, this is what I wanted to do. It came out exactly the way I thought it was going to,
and
I don't like it.
Yes, so let's change it.
If you want to just go into academic papers and you look up interlinguistics and you look at European journals, they have long histories. The volumes have been written on created languages over there. All of them, though, auxiliary languages.
Through history, it's been the idea that there's something wrong with natural language. Natural languages, they're all different, so we can't understand each other. They have all this ambiguity and inconsistency, and they don't need that. Why not get rid of that? Simplify things, make it easy to learn, easy to communicate.
An auxiliary language would be a language learned by speakers of different first languages. It would be a common language, and it would be a language which would promote international communication and presumably would thereby promote world peace.
There's this language sol re sol, a language that's based around the notion of the musical scale, the solfege scale, the 7 tones of music, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. And so this language is all built on combining those 7 syllables.
You know, that was a time in Europe where there was increasing awareness of the need for people to be able to communicate across countries. So Esperanto came about as a proposed solution to that problem, as did many other languages. So Esperanto was not the only one. There were dozens of languages that were proposed, dozens of languages that competed against each other, all responding to this growing sense that we need to be able to communicate.
Esperanto, of course, is by far the most successful language. There are tens of thousands of speakers all over the world, including native speakers. And from what I hear, you can go to virtually any major capital in the world and find Esperantoists who will be happy to take you in and talk to you in Esperanto.
Nun tempe mi loĝas en eta urbeto kun 60 homoj. Mi laboras en la vendeo de miaj avoj.
At the time when the idea of an auxiliary language got prestigious public attention, all sorts of grand social engineering projects were underway, and people really had a lot of faith in this top-down approach to engineering society. You could rebuild an economic system, you could rebuild a culture, you could make a language and put it out there, and people would use it. And as this century went on and the failures racked up on those kinds of grand projects, anything associated with it started to look sketchy, started to look like a crank idea, to think that you can make a language and impose it on people, or make a language and you'll put it out there and people will love it and they'll want it. That started to just look really naive. So the prestigious members of the projects and the committees that were looking into it started to back away from it and look towards other things.
Esperanto is clearly filling some sort of need, otherwise people wouldn't learn it and wouldn't use it. So it's doing something, but it's less obvious, less palpable exactly what that need is. It's a little bit more intangible.
Creating an auxiliary language, which was real popular in the 1800s, is inherently colonial. You're creating a category killer, which is really problematic. And I think there's a good reason that a lot of people don't want to do that today and say, actually, these people have language. We don't need to give them another one, right? So instead, I'm in this new world that I've created, and these people have a language now.
People can make a constructed language for a world that they've created. I want this race of alien creatures, or an imagined fantasy land. What sort of language would they speak there? What would it look like? But sometimes it's the other way around. The language comes first, and then they start filling out the details of the culture to fit that aesthetic property that they liked in the language.
An artistic language would be something which would really tickle someone's fancy, whether it has a particularly wonderful sound and sound system, whether the grammar is particularly interesting or ingenious or involved. What I enjoyed perhaps the most about creating Navi was the intellectual challenge of starting essentially from scratch and coming up with something that is a real communication system that really works and that has properties which I found appealing.
Every conlang is actually a mirror picture of its creator. And then if you get more speakers like Esperanto, it becomes like a mixture of all people who speak it.
In previous decades, if you were a professor of linguistics and someone came to you and said they were interested in Esperanto or invented languages, the first reaction would be, well, this person knows nothing about language. You don't sit down and decide what the data is going to be. We are scientists in the natural world recording what happens. You don't fiddle with it. You don't say, you know, I like the cow, but it could work a lot better. It's not very efficient, that would be ridiculous. Explore things using the conlang as a thought experiment, which is something you do in lots of fields. Let's imagine a cow that worked a little differently, and what do we learn about the real cow from thinking about the departures from those things?
Engineered languages are usually constructed to test out some sort of a theory, either about language or about thought.
Constructed languages can serve as a laboratory for testing certain linguistic hypotheses.
Would it be possible to have a language with no verbs? And if you did, how would it work? And that might lead to some insights about what the limits of the parameters of natural language might be.
They can be really helpful in making something that's simple that can study what you're interested in. So, for example, the main artificial language experiment I was involved with, we actually just submitted it for publication earlier this week, so fingers crossed. We were interested in studying the number systems of languages and how well people learn those number systems. We were particularly interested in number systems used in Korean. But the problem is, if we tried to teach someone Korean, Korean has a lot of other properties to it that we weren't really interested in. I mean, it would be great, ideally, we could just kind of force people to sit in a room and learn Korean and then come back to us and give us information. But mostly we were just kind of interested in this one particular phenomenon. So within linguistics, it can be really useful to have these artificial languages where you hold everything else constant. For our purposes, we wanted a simple sound structure, simple sentence structure, things like that. And we ended up finding fairly interesting results. So people ended up learning this Korean-like number system pretty well, even though they were American English speakers who should be making the exact opposite predictions. So that was pretty cool.
Why is it that constructed languages and nerd culture happens to overlap so strongly now? In the 1800s it didn't, right? In the 1800s constructed languages overlapped with poli-sci type people or philosophers, whereas now it tends to overlap with nerds. So what is it that has changed in the past 200 years about our concept of what language is that has led to that change as well? I can ask that question by studying constructed languages that I cannot ask by studying natural languages.
There was a long time where the language, I should put in quotes, could be gibberish. And presumably no one would know the difference. After Klingon, though, you can't do that anymore. Because even though 99.9% of the people who will see a movie or a TV show will not realize that the language has genuine structure, there will be a subset of fans, diehard fans, who will pounce on it and dissect it, and if it doesn't measure up, they're going to be very vocal about it.
Seeing not just the languages, but also the VFX, what it told everybody was, all those fantasy movies that we were trying to do in the 1970s, well, we can do them now and they look great. And that started just a chain reaction.
I think the public is becoming more aware that language is a fascinating thing. And a lot of people who had little interest in learning languages before somehow have found these languages absolutely fascinating and riveting.
They might say, ooh, I saw the Avatar movie and I really want to learn Na'vi. And they go looking for a list of words, and then they realize, whoa, it's not just a list of words. Wait, this is how you form a sentence. And if you want to say this, you have to know this other thing. And then they might drop it at that point. That happens a lot. But there's those kids are out there that you don't get linguistics in middle school, and you don't come across it unless you run into something like that. And I have met people who said, I never studied a foreign language until I got interested in Klingon. I started learning about it, and then I learned German because I learned about verbs and I was interested in how that worked. And then I learned Russian. So the first step was finding, encountering this idea, whoa, languages that don't work like English, and that could be Klingon or Na'vi or Dothraki, as your first step. And some people, when they make that discovery, think it's really cool. Not a lot of people, but those people out there, it's a good way to to get that first encounter.
I teach a class on constructed and invented languages. Did Picard just violate a Gracian maxim?
Yes.
Yes, a big one. When you teach the different aspects of linguistics, you can pick the languages that highlight that aspect best. It's much easier than teaching it through English, where people have all these preconceived notions because they've been using this language their entire lives. My goal for the class is to get students to start thinking about language as a thing, as an artifact of culture, in the same way that they think about art as an artifact of culture, or in the same way that we think about literature as a thing.
We have to take a story from a card and turn it into a relatable metaphor to use towards an illusion to represent another scenario.
Chemistry has chemistry sets. You can build an erupting volcano, you can dissect a frog, you can play with Lego or Lincoln Logs or Tinker Toys or anything like that for engineering. And so there's this kind of notion of, I can touch this. And by touching it, you get interested in it. You can talk about its context, you can talk about where it comes from, you can talk about who was using it, where they were. All of these things kind of get lost when we just talk about English or French in the abstract. And so when we're teaching constructed and invented languages, it's easier to get people to think about language artifactually. As a product of culture, as a product of people. Not the first thing that you want to say to somebody, like, hey, we cool? Is how I would probably start. There have been many times in my life that I've encountered some pushback to studying constructed languages, especially from people who study endangered natural languages. And I think that that's completely reasonable, right? If you're trying to get people to recognize that this language of a people who live on Earth is dying out, is in danger of dying, the idea that somebody's going to spend time on studying Klingon, which is really, or Dothraki or Na'vi, which are really just extensions of this really corporate structure that comes out of Hollywood, I can see why it could be really off-putting.
For some reason, people think you shouldn't be allowed to study language or work on language unless it's useful somehow. You know, why waste your time inventing a language when you could be saving Welsh, or you could be, you know, helping people learn actual languages in the world.
I was told in one way or another, in many ways actually, early on as a student in linguistics, that serious students of linguistics aren't interested in Esperanto. That's not a proper topic. But, you know, what could I do? This was a language that I spoke and speak. This is a language that, you know, at this point, I have spoken it most of my life. You know, I learned it relatively young. It's a language which has played an important role in my own personal life history. It's shaped who I am. It has informed, you know, who my friends are, my outlook on the world. All of this is shaped, as it should be and naturally is, by my experience as a speaker of Esperanto. So, you know, I can't, even if I wanted to, which I don't, but even if I wanted to, I couldn't just erase that or pretend that side of me doesn't exist.
It seems a bit cavalier to suggest that somebody who's just creating a language for fun, or you just suggest to them, well, why don't you just go, you know, save endangered languages? Like, you know, I'll go do that right now. It tends to stretch one's budget. Plus, it's often not the safest thing to do. But anyway, but there are linguists for that. There are linguists for that, and they've been trained to do it, and they do a very, very good job.
In retrospect, perhaps the most enjoyable thing about the whole experience is that there's now a whole community of Na'vi speakers, really scattered all over the world, who have embraced the language and adopted it and are using it for genuine communication. I mean, I get emails to me written entirely in Na'vi all the time.
There is a community for language creators, which is different from a community of Esperantists or a community of Klingonists. They're not people coming together around a particular language or a particular culture, people coming together just on their love of language experimentation.
The first conlanging community came about in the early 90s because of the internet. Language creation, I think, just on its own, well, especially before, say, 2009, with simply something that was extremely uncommon. So it was very rare that you would ever have any two language creators that would live close enough to one another that they would ever encounter one another.
It used to be this lonely hobby, that's the secret vice, as Tolkien called it, so they didn't know anyone else. A 12-year-old starts doing this, doesn't realize anyone else is doing it, and feels a little weird about it and doesn't know if what they're doing is any good. You can ask for advice as you would if you were a writer or a painter or something. You have a community of people who understand already at a basic level what you're doing and can appreciate your attempts to match your own vision.
The advice I would give to someone who wanted to create their own language is, first of all, learn something about the language in general before you even begin.
And really the first question you have to ask yourself is, well, what are you creating it for? Mm-hmm. Are you just messing around with it? Then have at it. Are you doing it for a book? Is it something that there's going to be a lot of in your book? Then you might want to, talk actually more about who is going to be speaking it and who these people are. Where did the language come from? Is it related to anything else? What are you doing with it? You kind of have to have, some sort of plan for it, I guess, even if it's very informal.
So, for example, if it's a language that's going to be part of an alien culture on another world, then you have to know what that world is like. You have to know what's going to be important to the speakers, because their lexicon, their vocabulary is going to reflect their environment. And then I guess you have to make it something that's going to be interesting to you, so that you're going to enjoy developing it.
What conlangs do you like, and investigate them
and why
find
do you
out,
like them?
Yeah, how do they do things and why, and what is it that appeals about that, and you can get an idea of what kinds of things you like and what would work for your conlang.
One of the things that just helps is looking at natural languages. And while reference grammars are always the best,
even a phrase book will do.
Yeah.
No one knows more about the exotic, the special, the weird and wonderful things that natural languages do than conlangers, because that's where the inspiration comes from. And it's to everybody's benefit that people keep being interested in that and learning about that and keeping those things alive.
Well, yeah, language is a living thing, actually, because it lives through us, through its speakers. So if there are no speakers of language, it's just dead. It doesn't move, it doesn't evolve. So you as a creator, your language is actually living through you. It's evolving through you, and while the language evolves, you evolve as well.